Hello and welcome to All About the Ancient World. Our channel is dedicated to promoting the voices of early career researchers in studies of the ancient world. This presentation is titled The Mysterious Origins of Zagreus, How Ancient Myth Inspired the Music of Hades. For the wildly popular 2020 video game Hades, Darren Korb composed the Hymn to Zagreus, a ballad steeped in ancient myth which recounts the mysterious origin of the game's protagonist. This lecture reviews each verse of the hymn to reveal how it was inspired by ancient Greek religion and modern scholarship. It is presented by Schiano. Schiano is a mobile educator for the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, who holds an MA in Classical Antiquity from the University of Colorado Boulder. A lifelong fan of classical reception, Sierra's research focuses on how the ancient Mediterranean is reimagined in contemporary pop culture and fandom media. And she is a team member of All About the Ancient World. Now, without further ado, please enjoy this presentation, All About the Ancient World.
In 2020, Supergiant Games released Hades, a video game set in the mythological world of ancient Greece, specifically in the ancient Greek underworld. As such, Hades is a work of classical reception, a piece of media that engages with the art, culture, and mythology of the ancient Mediterranean. Now, to accompany Supergiant's vivid reimagining of the underworld, musician Darren Korb composed a soundtrack that is at times loud and intense, and at others spooky and atmospheric. In particular, he composed and performed the Hymn to Zagreus, a song dedicated to Hades' protagonist, Zagreus, and sung in-game by Orpheus, a character inspired by the legendary musician of the same name from Greek mythology, whose music was said to be so beautiful it could even tame wild beasts.
Sing of Zagreus woes, slayer of hydras, first of his name.
Though the Hymn to Zagreus is original to the game, it's steeped in ancient myth. It evokes a lesser-known mythical tradition whereby Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and theater, was originally born with the name Zagreus. This ancient Zagreus was murdered as an infant, but then reborn as the Dionysus we know from more mainstream ancient myths. Since this alternate mythical tradition was thought to derive from the teachings of Orpheus, it became known as the Orphic tradition. These Orphic myths are thought to lie at the heart of the Mysteries of Dionysus, a secretive religious tradition in which ancient Mediterraneans worship Dionysus as a mediator between the worlds of the living and the dead, since he himself had once died and come back to life. Now, I've yet to find an interview that confirms this 100%, but I believe that Darren Korb and the staff of Supergiant Games invented this Hymn to Zagreus as a way of imagining how did these mysteries of Dionysus get their start? Why exactly is Dionysus sometimes called Zagreus? And what if Dionysus and Zagreus were actually two different people? So in this video, I will break down the lyrics to the Hymn to Zagreus verse by verse, discussing its various ancient literary precedents and then explaining how it was influenced by modern scholarship on the Orphic tradition. By discussing the hymn together with the game's plot and mechanics, I will demonstrate how the Hades game invents an origin for these oh-so-mysterious mysteries of Dionysus. But before we dive into discussing the hymn, I want to provide a bit more context for both Hades the video game and for ancient Greek religion more generally. You see, in the Hades game, our protagonist, Zagreus, is the prince of the underworld and son of the titular Hades, the god king of the dead. This is all inspired by Greek mythology and religion, of course. Ancient Greeks really did believe in a god named Hades, who ruled over the dead in the underworld, a supposedly physical location under the earth that is confusingly also sometimes called Hades. So the word Hades can refer to both the god, the location, and this video game. But to make things easier for this video, I'm only going to use Hades when talking about the god, and I will call the place where people go when they die the underworld. When referring to the video game, I'll verbally say Hades game to make it less confusing. So as for Zagreus, this is a name that does appear in ancient mythology, but very rarely. As you'll see later on, the exact nature and identity of Zagreus in Greek mythology is a little bit complicated. But anyway, in the Hades game, Hades and Zagreus are father and son, and they do not have a good relationship. The game consists of Zagreus rebelling against his cold and callous father by fighting his way out of the underworld in search of his long-lost mother Persephone, the goddess of verdure, or green growing things. Here's a little family tree for the Hades game's dysfunctional royal family. We have Hades, king of the underworld, Persephone, the missing queen, and their son Zagreus, the prince of the underworld. On his journey to the surface world, Zagreus receives help from many famous Olympian gods like Athena, Zeus, and Dionysus, in the form of power-ups and special abilities and that kind of thing. But every time the player messes up and gets killed by one of the many monsters guarding the path to the surface world, Zagreus is reborn back at home in the royal court of the underworld, known as the House of Hades, and he has to start his journey all over again.
Well, that was interesting.
So fighting, failing, dying, and being reborn are all part of the game's mechanics, and this is reflected in the game's story. Unlike many other video game protagonists, Zagreus is aware of every time he dies and revives. As the player continues with escape attempt after escape attempt, Zagreus develops, not just by becoming stronger, but by improving his relationships with the gods of the underworld and the gods of Olympus. This brings us to Orpheus. In the Hades game, Orpheus is the depressed court musician for the House of Hades. He and Zagreus are friends, and Zagreus often tries to cheer him up, even going so far as to reunite Orpheus with his long-lost love Eurydice. But at one point in the game, Dionysus convinces Zagreus to play a prank on Orpheus.
Hey Zag, ever see a fellow by the name of Orpheus down there? You ever heard of him? I bet you have. And I have had a funny thought, a little jest that maybe we could try if you'd be up to have a little harmless fun.
Harmless fun at the expense of Orpheus? You have my full and complete attention, Dionysus, mate.
That chap comes up with the most smashing songs, so I was thinking maybe we could spin him into old tales, something like how maybe you and I, like, we're connected or something. He'll buy it. Tell him for me, yeah?
Hey, Orpheus, you've noticed the resemblance between me and Dionysus, haven't you, mate? I'll tell you a little secret, but you have to promise not to tell. We're really the same god. I love a good feast, don't I?
But Zagreus, that is a striking revelation, the connection you describe. I see it. I can see it now. To think the god of wine and you are intricately linked, it isn't obvious, is it?
Oh, there's more to it. A bit grim, really, as I'm a little older than I look. You see, the Titans, they once tore me limb from limb, but then my heart was saved, and that's where Dionysus comes from. That is the connection between us. You understand me, mate?
Your tale stirs my soul. It truly does, my friend. It is a marvel to me that such heroism isn't widely known, and I'm committed to the spread of all such truths.
Dionysus and I appreciate it, mate.
So there we have it. Orpheus then proceeds to compose a hymn recounting the mighty feats and tragic birth of Zagreus, much to the prince's chagrin. Though Zagreus later tries to convince Orpheus that it was all just a prank and nothing in the hymn is true, Orpheus ignores Zagreus' protest and assumes that Zagreus is just being humble. Orpheus' hymn to Zagreus then spreads far and wide throughout the surface world, and it's implied that this song shapes the way we, in the real world, think about the godhood of Zagreus and Dionysus, not just as video game characters, but as actual gods from Greek mythology. But what are hymns, and how do they fit into ancient Greek religion? Well, to give a brief explanation, the ancient Greeks believed in many different gods, and they worshipped them in a couple different ways. Arguably, the most important was to provide the gods with animal sacrifices. But you could also dedicate art and precious materials to the gods at their temples and sanctuaries, like sculptures and tripods and finely woven clothes for their cult statues. You could also honor the gods through songs and poetry, and that's where the hymns come in. The most famous are the Homeric hymns. These are a collection of texts praising the Olympian gods that would have been recited orally and accompanied by music, so like songs, basically. They were composed by many different unnamed Greek poets, and they would have preceded some longer recitation of epic poetry. These hymns are called Homeric because they use the same meter and the similar language to Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. So one of the most famous Homeric hymns is the hymn to Demeter, the goddess of agriculture and the mother of Persephone. This poem recounts how Hades kidnapped Persephone and forced her into marriage as queen of the underworld. In response, Demeter rebelled against Zeus, the king of the gods, until he forced Hades to reluctantly allow Persephone to return to the surface world for half of every year. So when Persephone descends under the earth to be queen of the underworld, we have winter, where Demeter mourns and nothing grows. But when Persephone reemerges to join her mother, we have spring, and the earth comes back to life. To many Greeks, this hymn to Demeter was not just a story, but the foundational myth for the mystery cult to Demeter. To back up a little bit, when scholars use the term cult when talking about Greek religion, we don't mean to imply the same negative connotations that come with modern cults, like Scientology or Heaven's Gate. The word cult basically just refers to the way a particular god is worshipped in a particular place in a particular way. So ancient Greek religion is full of many different cults, which people participated in a variety of ways, including individual worship, big citywide festivals, and even international events like the Olympic Games. Some religious practices, however, were very exclusive. Mystery cults are cults which kept their rituals secret and required people to be initiated before they could participate in worship of the god. You see, the ancient Greek word for initiation is maisis, and the word for secret rituals is mysteria. That's how we get the English word mystery, and that's why scholars call certain cults mystery cults, or just the mysteries of the blank god. So, in the mystery cult of Demeter, you first had to be initiated, and you needed to learn the secret rituals before you were fully participating in the cult. So these ancient initiates were so good at keeping these things secret that we actually still don't know what their rituals entailed even now. But most theories posit that maybe initiates gained some kind of secret knowledge about the cycle of life and death, as symbolized by Persephone's descent and then re-emergence from the underworld. But Demeter and Persephone are not the only gods who received mystery cult worship. Dionysus was also worshipped in a mainstream sense as the god of wine and viticulture and theater, but also in the mysterious sense as a god of rebirth and sort of celebration in the afterlife. How do we know this? Well, there's lots of these little references to the mysteries of Dionysus scattered throughout the writings of ancient authors. For example, Diodorus of Sicily was a historian who wrote a very long history of the world called the Bibliotheca Historica, or the Library of History. At one point in this text, he spends a lot of time discussing Dionysus and says there are certain stories set forth in the Orphic poems and introduced into the cult's rites, but it is not lawful to recount them in detail to the uninitiated. So what are these Orphic poems that only initiates are allowed to know? Well, the adjective Orphic just means related to Orpheus. In myth, Orpheus was thought to be the first initiate into the mysteries of Dionysus, and he once descended into the underworld in search of his recently deceased wife, Eurydice. He failed to bring his wife back to life, but he himself was able to survive the journey back to the world of the living. It seems that some ancient Greeks thought that this journey granted Orpheus some kind of special knowledge about the cycle of life and death, that he could then communicate to them through his poems and songs. Are you seeing a pattern here? It seems like the act of descending into the underworld and then re-emerging into the world of the living, like metaphorically dying and then being reborn, was thought to make both Orpheus and Persephone into these figures that could guide initiates through the inevitable process of dying and traveling to the underworld. But they also promise initiates some kind of rebirth, right? Some sense that, like Persephone and Orpheus, you'll survive and things will be okay. And if Dionysus can provide you with wine and feast and entertainment in life, who better to grant you those same blessings in death? So Orpheus was thought to have composed a collection of hymns praising the underworld gods who were particularly important to the mystery cult of Dionysus. Like the Homeric hymns, we don't know exactly who composed these Orphic hymns and when, but these poems and all those other little textual references to the mysteries of Dionysus I mentioned earlier, these are what make up what scholars call the Orphic tradition. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering why I'm talking so much about the mysteries of Dionysus and not the mysteries of Zagreus. Well, that's because, as far as we can tell in ancient Greek religion, Zagreus really was the same god as Dionysus. Like, they weren't two separate divinities. Zagreus was just an earlier or an alternate name for Dionysus. I mean, this really isn't that unusual for Greek gods. They all have many different names and epithets. For instance, Dionysus is often commonly referred to as Bacchus. I mean, it's possible that Zagreus could have started out as a separate divinity, that people just sort of combined with Dionysus over time. But the name Zagreus itself only shows up in 3 ancient sources, and they all associate the name very closely with Dionysus. So first, we have Nonnus's Dionysiaca. Nonnus was a Greek poet from the Imperial Roman period, and the Dionysiaca is a very long epic poem about the life of Dionysus. Here, Zagreus is pretty explicitly used as just another name for the older Dionysus. More on that older part later. Then we have a fragmentary play from the Greek playwright Euripides, called The Cretans. This play isn't preserved in its entirety. That means only small fragments of text survive. But one of those fragments calls Dionysus night-roaming Zagreus. And then finally, we have another fragment, this time from Callimachus, another Greek poet, whose poem, the AATAW, uses the name Dionysus Zagreus. And that's it. Like, those 3 references are the only ancient evidence we have for a mythical figure named Zagreus. And as you can see, the name is so closely associated with Dionysus that there's really no reason to believe that the Greeks themselves believed in some, separate god named Zagreus. I mean, I can't even show you a work of art depicting Zagreus because literally none exist. I could show you a million pictures of Dionysus, though. Now, obviously, the developers at Supergiant Games needed a unique protagonist for their story, and I doubt they wanted to deal with the confusion of having their Prince of the Underworld also somehow be the Olympian god of wine. So they took the name Zagreus and invented a character who is totally separate from Dionysus. And what better way to celebrate this newly invented god than by giving him his own Orphic hymn? Since there is no actual ancient hymn to Zagreus in this collection of Orphic hymns, it seems that Darren Korb just decided to make his own, and thus the hymn to Zagreus was born. Now let's take a closer look at the lyrics of each verse.
Sing of Zagreus, O muse, slayer of hydras, first of his name.
So, right off the bat, we have an invocation of the Muses, the 9 divinities who presided over the arts and inspired poets, playwrights, and all other kinds of artists. The specific phrase, sing of Zagreus, O Muse, it mimics the opening lines of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, which begin, rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, and sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns. The Homeric and Orphic hymns begin a similar way, stating the name of the god who's about to be praised, and then usually providing a few epithets as well. For example, the Orphic hymn to Dionysus starts by calling the god protagonon diffue trigonon, and this translates to first made, double-natured, and thrice born. For Zagreus, we have Slayer of Hydras, a title which has absolutely no ancient mythical precedent, but it directly alludes to one of the game's boss battles, the Bone Hydra.
Born of Zeus as a serpent, in spite of Queen Hera, Zagreus came.
The line born of Zeus as a serpent might raise eyebrows, but that's a direct reference to Nonnus's description of Zagreus / Dionysus' birth. He recounts how, before Hades kidnapped Persephone, all the male gods were vying for Persephone's hand in marriage. This scared her mother Demeter so much that she hid Persephone away in a cave to keep her from all these men. But unfortunately, there was one god who was particularly obsessed with Persephone, and that was Zeus, her father. So Nonnus spends many lines describing Zeus's uncontrollable lust for Persephone, and eventually proclaims, "Ah, maiden Persephone, you could not find how to escape your mating. No, a dragon was your mate, when Zeus changed his face, and came, rolling in a many loving coil, through the dark to the corner of the maid's chamber. By this marriage with the heavenly dragon, the womb of Persephone swelled with living fruit, and she bore Zagreus." So yeah, born of Zeus as a serpent is a pretty concise way of summing up how Zeus disguises himself as a snaky dragon creature to assault / seduce Persephone. It's really not clear how consensual this is, but it's definitely incestuous. And this is something that Clement of Alexandria particularly objected to in his exhortation to the Greeks. Titus Flavius Clemens was a Christian theologian who documented Greek polytheistic religion in a very critical way, and he makes sure that in his account of the birth of Dionysus, it is very clear that this is an incestuous coupling. Which is probably why the Hades games Hymn to Zagreus makes no mention of Zagreus' mother. I mean, it also makes sense because at this point in the game, his mother's identity is still a mystery. You actually don't find out it's Persephone until the very end of the game. Spoilers. So even though we, the players, know that Hades is Zagreus' father, not Zeus, Darren Korb probably didn't want to make any kind of allusion to father-daughter incest in his song. Though, I mean, in myth, Hades is still Persephone's uncle, and Zeus and Demeter are still siblings, so godly incest is kind of unavoidable either way. But before we move on, this line, in spite of Queen Hera, it alludes to Zeus's infamous infidelity, where Zeus is always sleeping with someone other than his wife Hera. In this case, it's the unnamed mother of Zagreus, who we know to be Persephone.
Torn to shreds by the Titans, devoured in pieces from his altar flame.
So, torn to shreds by the Titans. Yeah, things don't really end well for the infant Zagreus/Dionysus. Nana says, by the fierce resentment of implacable Hera, the Titans, who were the generation of divinities that came before the Olympian gods, destroyed him with an infernal knife. There where his limbs had been cut piecemeal by the Titan steel, the end of his life was the beginning of a new life as Dionysus. So according to Nonus, it's Hera's jealousy that led directly to Zagreus' death, meaning that previous line, in spite of Queen Hera, could have been foreshadowing. But Clement continues on to say, but the Titans, they who tore him to pieces, placed a cauldron upon a tripod, and casting the limbs of Dionysus into it, first boiled them down, then piercing them with spits, they roasted his limbs over an open flame and ate him. So this line from the Hymn to Zagreus, devoured in pieces, it's directly alluding to the Titans' cannibalism as told by Clement. Clement's account is also clearly what inspired the dialogue we saw earlier between Zagreus and Orpheus, when Zagreus is coming up with his tall tale to prank the musician. This act of cannibalism can be interpreted as a form of corrupted sacrifice. You see, a good and correct sacrifice involves killing and eating an animal, not a human or a god. So this scene can be taken as an inversion of that form of worship, and thus as a corrupted form of worship. Also, the fact that Zagreus is torn to pieces in the words of Clement and torn to shreds in the words of Darren Korb is a fun little allusion to something called sparagmos. So, sparagmos is ancient Greek for tearing, rendering, or mangling, and it's a term usually associated with Dionysus and his followers as something that they do to other people. So, for example, Euripides' play The Bacchae, it ends with Dionysus' female followers, the Maenads, tearing Dionysus' enemy limb from limb as punishment for his hubris. So the fact that it's Dionysus who suffers sparagmos in the Orphic tradition is also a fun, little, interesting inversion. And finally, this line from his heart of flame. It draws attention to Dionysus' heart in particular. This probably refers to Clement and Proclus's versions of the story. You see, Clement mentions that before the Titans could devour the pieces of Dionysus, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, made off with the heart of Dionysus, rescuing it before it could be eaten. And then we have Proclus. Proclus Lycius was a Greek polytheist resisting the rise of Christianity in late antiquity, who wrote his own collection of hymns to the Greek gods. In his hymn to Athena, he praises the goddess by saying, "You who save the heart as yet unchopped of Lord Bacchus in the vault of heaven, when he was once divided up by the hands of the Titans, and you brought it to his father Zeus, in order that, through the ineffable wishes of his begetter, a new Dionysus would grow again from Semele." So even though Darren Korb's Hymn to Zagreus doesn't mention anything about Athena at all, this focus on Zagreus' heart of flame could be an allusion to this part of the Orphic tradition, where Athena rescues Zagreus' heart and delivers it to Zeus so that Dionysus can be born again to a new mortal mother. It's also possible that this part of the game influenced the game developers too, since Athena is the very first Olympian god to make contact with Zagreus in the game. She's the first one to help him on his journey out of the underworld, and it's thanks to her influence that all the other Olympian gods start helping as well.
The seed of Dionysus grew, the god of wine and feast anew, to live at home on Olympus, never presuming his origins true.
Alright, so as we saw with Proclus's hymn to Athena just a moment ago, the death of Zagreus / older Dionysus, it's all leading up to the birth of the younger Dionysus, who we know from other Greek myths. As the hymn to Zagreus says, this younger Dionysus is the god of wine and feast, and he lives at home on Olympus with his father Zeus and all the other Olympian gods. Now, this verse starts by mentioning the seed of Dionysus, and this could allude to the salvaged heart of Zagreus that Proclus says Athena rescues and Zeus revives so that the new Dionysus would grow again. Now, Hyginus, a Roman author whose summaries of Greek myths are known as the fabulae, or stories, has a very literal interpretation of this whole heart of Zagreus becomes the seed of Dionysus thing. In his summary of the myth, Hyginus says, the son of Father Zeus and Persephone was dismembered by the Titans, so Zeus gave Semele the crushed heart of Dionysus in a potion, from which Semele then became pregnant. So she literally eats the heart of Zagreus, and this becomes the seed of Dionysus in her womb. Now, I've mentioned this name Semele a few times already, and you might be wondering, who is this woman, and what happened to her? Well, in the works of most ancient Greek poets, and in the Homeric hymns to Dionysus, Dionysus' parents are Zeus and a mortal woman named Semele, and that's it. Persephone normally does not factor into the story at all. I would show you a picture of Semele, but she doesn't really appear in Greek art all that much. But basically, while Semele is pregnant, a jealous Hera convinces her to ask Zeus if she can behold him in his true godly form. This obviously does not end well. Semele is a mere mortal, so she gets burned to death by witnessing Zeus's divine lightning. But Zeus is able to save the fetus from Semele's womb and replant it in his thigh. And so Dionysus is later reborn from Zeus's thigh, as shown on this vase. And this sort of double birth, right? First from Semele's dying body, and then from Zeus's thigh. This is why Dionysus is often called twice born. But do you remember back when I mentioned the epithets used for Dionysus in the Orphic hymns to Dionysus? It was protagonon, difue, trigonon, meaning first made, double-natured, and thrice born. Well, this is because initiates into the mystery cult of Dionysus include Dionysus' first birth to Persephone, his second birth / emergency C-section from Semele, and finally his third birth from Zeus's thigh. You know, it's kind of funny because this whole confusion over how many times was Dionysus born and how many Dionysuses are there, it's something that ancient authors were also puzzling over. I briefly mentioned this earlier, but Diodorus of Sicily spends many pages discussing Dionysus and how some have handed down the story that there was but one Dionysus, others that there were 3. So needless to say, this is all very complicated. But the recurring idea here is that there's an older Dionysus, sometimes called Zagreus, whose mother is Persephone. He dies, and he is reborn as a newer Dionysus, whose mother is Semele. So ancient Mediterraneans who followed the Orphic tradition would say that Dionysus is thrice born, and that his parents are Persephone, Zeus, and Semele. But everyone else would just say that he's twice born, and his parents are only Zeus and Semele. Make sense?
Wrath of thunder and lightning struck down the Titans, burned into sand.
Alright, so in these lyrics we have Zeus having his revenge on the Titans for killing his son. This is pretty well attested in ancient sources. I mean, we have Clement simply stating that Zeus plagues the Titans with thunder, but Nonnus gives a much longer narrative about how Zeus's wrath affects the entire earth with fire and flood. He says, Zeus attacked the mother of Titans, aka the earth, with an avenging brand, and shut up the murders of horned Dionysus within the gates of Tartarus, aka hell. He blasts all corners of the earth with his thunderbolt in love for his child. But eventually, Zeus calmed his wrath at the sight of the scorched earth. He pitied her and wished to wash with water the ashes of ruin and the fiery wounds of the land. Then rainy Zeus covered the whole sky with clouds and flooded all of the earth. Pretty extreme reaction, but maybe not exactly unwarranted. And we can see how Nonnus's narrative likely influenced Darren Korb's use of wrath of thunder and lightning and his description of the Titans burned into the sand.
Up from out in the ashes, born of the Titans, the mortals did stand.
So this this verse implies that humankind originates from the death of Zagreus. So here's the order. We have Zeus kills the Titans. He burns them into the earth. And then up from their ashes is born humanity. Now this might sound crazy, but it's almost one-to-one with the account of Dionysus' birth from Olympiodorus. Olympiodorus was an early Byzantine scholar who wrote many commentaries on the dialogues of Plato, a famous Greek philosopher from several centuries earlier. In a commentary on a dialogue called the Phaedo, we get the following excerpt. Then Zeus is succeeded by Dionysus, whom, they say, his retainers the Titans tear to pieces through Hera's plotting, and they eat his flesh. Zeus, incensed, strikes them with his thunderbolt, and the soot of the vapors that rise from them becomes the matter from which men are created. So this idea of the Titans being divine ancestors of humans is pretty unique. There are a couple different origin stories for humans in Greek myth, but none of them are connected to the Titans in this way. There is an Orphic hymn to the Titans, though, and it states, "From you are descended all toiling mortals, all generations of the world born of you." So this does seem to be a pretty important foundational myth for the Orphic tradition and the mysteries of Dionysus. Now this is an interesting verse. It implies that humans are modeled after the gods and contain some divinity ourselves, but somehow our humanity also makes us flawed? Olympiodorus touches on this a little bit, this idea of mortals being divine, when he's explaining why Plato thinks suicide is wrong. So, bear with me here. Again, remember, Olympiodorus was writing commentaries on Plato's dialogues, and there's a point in the Phaedo where Plato says it's forbidden to kill yourself. So Olympiodorus tries to explain it's bad to hurt your body because our bodies are belonging to Dionysus. We are in fact part of him, being made from the soot of the Titans who ate his flesh. So Olympiodorus is saying our bodies are Dionysian. We're made from Dionysus, we're part of him, and it's wrong to harm a god. So we're not just descended from the Titans, we're also descended from Dionysus through the Titans' cannibalism. Now, it seems to me that Darren Korb has just sort of generalized this whole idea into humans being divine rather than specifically Dionysian, and, modeled after the gods, plural, rather than just modeled after Dionysus. But this last lyric about humans being further flawed than the gods, it might be influenced less by ancient evidence and more by how modern scholarship has interpreted that evidence. For example, classicist Sarah Eels Johnson argues that initiates into the mysteries of Dionysus would have understood that humans are inherently lesser than gods, further flawed, because humanity's sort of spontaneous and unintentional birth from the death of the Titans parallels the creation of other monsters in Greek mythology. She argues the immediate parallel to a Greek mind would come from Hesiod's Theogony. When the blood from a fallen Titan fell upon the earth, it generated the giants, the Erinyes, and the ash tree nymphs. The point is clear. When touched by the blood of a dreadful god, the earth sends forth dreadful creatures. Those dreadful creatures being us. So, do you remember that bit about how the Titans killing Dionysus and eating him is also a form of corrupted sacrifice? Well, Johnson argues that the guilt for this primal error, for this corrupted sacrifice, is inherited by humanity from the Titans, and further compounds the defectiveness of humanity. She theorizes that the death of Zagreus, or older Dionysus, it explains human suffering. We suffer because we are inherently defective and monstrous, because our ancestors are cannibals. But this also opens up the possibility for salvation. Johnston theorizes that the mystery cult of Dionysus must have promised its initiates a happy afterlife if they completed various purification rituals, which were aimed to alleviate Persephone's ancient grief for the loss of her son. Now, there is some debate among scholars regarding whether the mysteries of Dionysus actually included this mandate that humans atone for the ancient grief which the Titans caused Persephone. Classicist Radcliffe Emmons pushes back against this idea that a core tenet of the Orphic tradition was salvation from original sin through the death and resurrection of the suffering god. Edmonds basically points out that Christian models have influenced the way that modern scholars interpret the ancient evidence we've discussed so far. After all, it's Christians who believe that humans inherit an original sin from Adam and Eve, and that salvation is only possible through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Edmonds basically breaks down the Zagreus myth into 4 components. First, we have the dismemberment of Dionysus. Second, we have the punishment of the Titans. Third, the creation of mankind from the Titans. And 4, we have the inheritance humans receive from the first 3 elements. The burden of guilt from the Titans' crime, and also the divine spark from the remains of Dionysus. He argues that while ancient sources provide testimony for the first 3 components of the myth, the final component, this resulting original sin, is an addition of modern scholars. So, what did the initiates into the mysteries of Dionysus really think about the death of Zagreus/Dionysus and the nature of humanity? Did they really think that humans are at once divine and further flawed? I don't know. But we can see from songs like the Hymn to Zagreus that these questions are certainly thought-provoking, and they hold the power to inspire artists even today.
In twain, the blood of immortals, of Zagreus ending, it flows in their veins.
So, coming up on the end of the song, we again have this reminder that the blood of immortals, specifically the blood of Zagreus, is part of humanity. That we descend from Zagreus' ending, from his death at the hands of the Titans, and therefore a little bit of divinity flows in our veins. But this emphasis on blood in veins, it doesn't appear in any of the ancient sources. Instead, it seems to connect to a piece of lore specific to the game Hades. So, one of the questions that comes up as you play the game is, what exactly is Zagreus the god of? I mean, the character himself doesn't even know. He thinks he isn't the god of anything. But if Zagreus the video game character is a separate divinity from Dionysus the video game character, shouldn't the game developers have made him the god of something? It's definitely not wine and celebration, so what is it? Well, a tiny clue appears on one of the in-game character bios for Thanatos, the god of death. These bios are written by Achilles, a character based off the legendary warrior and hero of the Trojan War, who, in the game, Hades has employed in death as a sort of tutor for Zagreus. So, in this character bio, Achilles was wondering why his student Zagreus is so close to Thanatos, the god of death. In the Hades game, Zagreus and Thanatos are actually childhood friends, and you even have the option to romance Thanatos if you want. Achilles ultimately theorizes that Zagreus must be the god of blood, of life, and that this is why he's so inexorably drawn to the god of death. So Zagreus being the god of blood actually makes a lot of sense when you look at the rest of the game. Zagreus is the only god who bleeds red blood, like a human. Every time Zagreus dies, there's an animation where blood sprays out all around him and he collapses into a pool of blood. This pool is in fact part of the river Styx, a literal river of blood which flows all throughout the underworld. It's from this river that Zagreus emerges reborn in the House of Hades after each failed escape attempt. Oh, and also the theme song for this game, which Darren Korb also composed and performed, is literally called In the Blood. They're not exactly being subtle, but people often associate blood with death and injury, which is understandable because usually the sight of blood is a sign of some kind of injury or death, but it is also a life-giving force, which I think is why Achilles makes this jump between god of blood and god of life, and perhaps why we see Darren Korb evoking this idea of Zagreus' blood giving life to humans in the Hymn to Zagreus. So calling Zagreus the prince here evokes his in-game role as the prince of the underworld. It basically has no connection to the ancient tradition. There are no pieces of textual or archaeological evidence to suggest that ancient Mediterraneans thought Zagreus or older Dionysus somehow lived on as like a secret separate divinity from the younger Dionysus, as like the prince of the underworld. This verse is basically entirely dedicated to the lore of the video game, especially with the line, "Prisoner to his king, never to leave." That's a reference to the primary conflict of the game, after all. How Zagreus is rebelling against Hades, his king, and attempting to escape the underworld, even though he is doomed never to leave. It's only at the very, very end of the game that Zagreus reunites with Persephone and convinces her to rejoin them in the underworld, where they can begin to mend their familial relationships. So in the end, Zagreus really does never leave the underworld, but he does make it a more enjoyable place to live, a place he can finally call home. Before we move on to the last verse, I do want to draw attention to this phrase, under the mortal ring. It's kind of an unusual choice of words, and it seems to be riffing off the expression, this mortal coil, which was made famous by Hamlet's to be or not to be soliloquy. See, Shakespeare uses mortal coil as a sort of metaphor for life and all its trials and tribulations. But I wonder if Darren Korb is using mortal ring to refer more literally to the cycle of death and rebirth that Zagreus lives in as part of the mechanics of this game. So, even near the end of the game, when Zagreus succeeds in escaping the underworld and finds his mother, he discovers that he can't stay with her on the earth for very long. His entire being is tied to the underworld, and he dies a natural but accelerated death every time he's on the surface. So even though Zagreus can escape the underworld, he can't escape death. He can't escape this mortal ring, which just brings him right back around to being reborn in the River of Styx in the House of Hades.
Steadfast, endlessly toiling, doomed to remain. Endlessly toiling, doomed to remain.
And this brings us to the final verse. Endlessly toiling, doomed to remain. The repetition of these lines and the repetitive actions described by these lines, they again are echoing the game's mechanics with its infinite loop of escape attempt after escape attempt. But it also echoes the mythical Zagreus / Dionysus's intrinsic connection with the cycle of life and death, and his role as a mediator between the worlds of the living and the worlds of the dead. Just like Persephone and Orpheus, right? After all, because Dionysus himself has died, he can offer comfort and reassurance to initiates in his mystical, since he is shared in their suffering in some way. And because Dionysus himself was then reborn, he can promise his initiates a similar kind of rebirth and rejuvenation, and an afterlife filled with wine and feasting. As for Zagreus, the video game character, even though he may be doomed to always return to the underworld, it's because of his journey that he's able to reunite with his mother and improve his relationships with the other gods of the underworld. So although this hymn ends on a pretty somber note, the fact that Zagreus is so steadfast, in spite of it all, positions him as a sort of figure of hope, as someone who never stops seeking a better life for himself.
Orpheus, sorry to interrupt. It's just I couldn't help but notice that new ballad that you're playing there.
Technically, why not consider it a hymn, my friend, in honor of your numerous travails, prior to your current set of circumstances, which must pale in comparison to all the rigors you've endured to date.
The thing is, none of the information in your hymn is accurate. It's nonsense. I was just kidding with you, mate. I tried to make that clear. You get so lively when I tell you my tall tales, you know? You're not angry with me, are you?
Heavens no, my friend. Your humility is matched only by your perseverance in the face of adversity. May your great deeds live on forever, much like you.
Cheers.
I had a feeling that our court musician would eventually come back to his senses and his talents, boy. Here yet again, my intuitions were correct. Though you appear a bit perturbed. Don't like the song? It's about you.
It says I'm really the bastard son of Zeus, but also indelibly connected to the god of wine, and how your parents tore me to pieces, giving rise to mortals, but that I'm always going to be stuck here.
You fill Orpheus's mind with nonsense, he produces nonsense. Nonsense, I presume, shall spread from this place far and wide, so everyone might know that I have nothing to do with you.
I'm not worried. Orpheus plays for a very small audience. I hope.
So the game implies that Zagreus is pretty embarrassed by Orpheus's hymn, and he hopes that it doesn't spread outside of the House of Hades and affect mortals' impression of him. This is, of course, meant to be an ironic joke because that's exactly what happened, right? It's implied that the real-life mysteries of Dionysus are the direct result of this prank. And I think that's a fun way for Darren Korb and the staff of Supergiant Games to sort of imagine an origin story for the Orphic tradition and the mysteries of Dionysus. I mean, after all, we still don't know exactly what rituals the initiates into this mystery cult practiced, or what secret stories they told each other. Our evidence is scattered, and it comes from wildly different time periods, which makes sense because, this reflects the nature of non-organized polytheistic religion. But it is kind of funny to imagine, what if this was all because someone just made up a story to play a prank on someone else? What if it wasn't meant to make sense? But regardless of whether we'll ever know the true nature of the mysteries of Dionysus or the original version of the Orphic myth of Zagreus, it's pretty cool to see how these ideas have inspired modern creatives like Darren Korb and the staff of Supergiant Games to create works of classical reception that specifically respond to these aspects of ancient Mediterranean culture. I mean, not only did they create a fun game with unique music, they took the opportunity to reimagine the story of a very little-known ancient Greek god and sing his praises for the world to hear.
Thank you for watching The Mysterious Origins of Zagreus, How Ancient Myth Inspired the Music of Hades, presented by our very own Sierra Schiano. If you have any questions about the content of this lecture, please leave a comment below. If you liked this video and want to see more, click subscribe and make sure to hit the notification bell to get updates for future videos. Also, be sure to check out our website, which you can find linked in the description below. You can also follow us on social media so that you never miss an update. Finally, if you're an early career researcher and you have an idea for a lecture, please take a look at the call for papers on our website and consider applying today. Our next deadline is June 1st. We hope you enjoy learning all about the ancient world, and we'll see you in the next video.